Hello, and welcome to this week's episode of A Mic on the Podium with me, Michael Seal. If this podcast has helped you gain an interest in conductors and conducting, may I suggest you can learn even more by subscribing to my Patreon page. With 6 different levels to choose from, you get the chance to read articles, listen to 2 new series of interviews, take part in group Zoom meetings, personal Zoom meetings with myself, and even get the chance to have conducting lessons from me. Details are in the show notes below, and I'd love to get to know more of you personally when you subscribe at patreon.com/a-mic-on-the-podium. Today, I conduct a conversation with an American conductor who won the Malko Competition in 2009. He is the music director of the Phoenix Orchestra of Boston, and is just coming to the end of his time as artistic director of the Lucerne Chamber Orchestra. He also writes and hosts one of the most successful classical music podcasts. It's a great pleasure to welcome Joshua Weilerstein. Josh, wonderful to speak to you today. How are you?
Good, thanks for having me.
Real pleasure. I know that during lockdown, many of us have been doing different things. Going to conducting, I haven't looked at a single score. I wonder whether you have, but I know you've been busy doing other things. For instance, you've performed all of Bartók's 44 duos for 2 violins with 44 different violinists. That must have taken some organising, maybe a little bit of practicing as well. But what else have you been doing? And how did you come about that idea?
I've actually been quite busy, despite not having any actual conducting work during the pandemic. But it's been quite wonderful to be home, of course, kind of recognizing the privilege of being able to say that. It's actually the most time that my wife and I have ever spent together in our whole relationship. So that's been really wonderful in a way. In terms of studying, I just started studying a few weeks ago because my first concerts are in September with the Beethoven cycle in Lausanne. And as soon as it hit July 1st, suddenly September 1st seemed much closer. And I felt like I needed to really get back with all of those, and actually learning all of them at the same time. Obviously, just the amount of notes is quite daunting. So I've been going through those, but at a more relaxed pace than I normally study at, which has been really wonderful. I've been able to dig in a lot deeper. In terms of the Bartók, that was right at the beginning of all of this when we really didn't know what was going to happen. And, it looked like we might not have concerts for 2 years at that point. And I was just trying to think of ways to connect musically with friends. And my original idea was to do the duos with my dad. And then I thought, actually, why don't I do it with my dad as one of the duos, but with all violinists from all around the world, all my friends and colleagues who I've worked with. And I didn't know if it would work, but I sent a million Facebook messages and emails and Twitter DMs to people. And, people really got super excited about it. And it took a lot of work, but it was one of the more, surprisingly enough, one of the more musically gratifying experiences I've had in years.
Well, if I'd have known, I might have even practiced and come and join you. So the violin obviously is something you still play, and I am assuming it would be the instrument you started on. Would I be right? How did music first come into your childhood?
Yeah, I did start on the violin. I grew up in an extremely musical family. My father was a violinist, and was the first violinist of the Cleveland Quartet for 20 years, and then became a wonderful violin teacher at the Cleveland Institute of Music and New England Conservatory of Music and the Juilliard School. And my mom is a pianist, wonderful chamber musician, teacher. She teaches piano, collaborative piano, and chamber music at NEC now as well. My sister is a wonderful cellist who's played all around the world. So I grew up, obviously, with music all around me. I, though, played the violin much more as a hobby. I didn't take it nearly as seriously as my sister did. My sister, I think, basically knew she wanted to be a professional cellist from the time she put her hands on the cello the first time. And I certainly didn't want that at first. At the beginning, the violin was no more than a hobby and something I did. I always joked I did it 25 minutes a day, 5 days a week, 3 seasons a year, because every summer it just went in the case and I didn't touch it.
And you'd be outside doing sports and activities, and I mean, I was much the same.
Exactly.
When it came around to summer, I was going to play cricket, and that was the end of it. If there was practice to be done, tough. I wasn't, it
Right,
wasn't going to
right,
stop
right.
me. Yeah.
Yeah.
And so, what changed all of that? What changed your attitude from thinking, well, it's a bit of fun, it's a nice hobby to have? What changed that?
So when I was 14, my parents moved to Boston. They were teaching at Cleveland Institute, and then they moved to teach at NEC. And one of the ways my parents thought I could make new friends was to join the Youth Philharmonic Orchestra, which was conducted at that time by Benjamin Zander. And I had refused in Cleveland to join the Cleveland Orchestra Youth Orchestra. First of all, because I didn't think I was good enough, but also because the rehearsals were on the weekends and they were 4 hours long. And I didn't want to give up 4 hours of my weekend to have an orchestra rehearsal.
Mm.
So one of the ways that my parents convinced me to join the Youth Philharmonic Orchestra in Boston was that the rehearsals were only 2.5 hours long. And so I said, okay, well, I can deal with that for a Saturday. Also, I wanted to make friends. And so I joined this orchestra, and at first, to be honest, and Ben will say the same thing, I wasn't really that excited about it. And I was back in I was basically an outer space in the back of the second violin section, because I never practiced and my audition was horrible. But slowly I started really falling in love with it and really enjoying playing. I still didn't consider doing it professionally, but I really enjoyed playing. And then we went on a tour of Panama and Guatemala, which was sort of what I call the light bulb moment for me, because we played for thousands of kids who had never seen a symphony orchestra before. And their kind of euphoric reaction to especially things like La Valse and the William Tell Overture, it was a kind of, I think partly because I grew up surrounded by so many musicians, it wasn't unusual to me to see musicians react, ecstatically to music, but to see kids who had never heard music react that way, that was a new experience for me. So I got really excited by that. And that same summer, I went to the Greenwood Music Camp, which is in a tiny town in Massachusetts called Covington, of all places. And it's basically a chamber music camp for high school students. And that was another one of those experiences where I suddenly was around a lot of people my age who just loved music so much. And that summer, that became the moment where I decided this is actually what I wanted to do.
It's amazing, isn't it, how something like a youth orchestra that you join, and especially a tour. I mean, it's just going slightly off track for a minute. I conducted a youth orchestra recently, and I'd heard that some of the managers above the youth orchestra, basically the bean counters and the money counters, were dead against the youth orchestra touring because they just said it was a jolly for the teachers. Which
Right.
they had no idea that what touring can bring to a young musician, and that bonding experience over the rehearsal process, and then 1 or 2 weeks away on the road and staying in hotels or even in athletes camps or wherever it is you're staying. It can be a moment that changes somebody's life forever. I remember my first major tour was to Brazil in 1986 with my county orchestra, and I'll never forget that. Never forget that. And it's such a shame that it seems to be nothing to do with the pandemic, but it seemed to be something that was gently being eroded over time over the last 10 to 15 to 20 years. And it's such a shame.
I mean, this is maybe a controversial opinion, but I think that youth orchestras would be better off touring than some professional orchestras, in terms of the experience that it can provide. I don't know, I might have become a musician without that tour, but I certainly would have had a less rich childhood. I was so lucky to have gone to that. And then we went 2 years later to Venezuela, which was another life-changing experience in another completely different way. So yeah, those tours for me were unbelievably special in a way that professional orchestra tours that I've been on have not been. They've been wonderful and exciting and fantastic to travel and see new places and to play in new halls. But in terms of that fundamental life experience, those tours, I'll never forget those.
No, I think you're right. It is a life experience, and a professional tour depending on where you're touring and what the program is and who's conducting, if you're in the orchestra, or what you're conducting if you're the conductor, can sometimes feel more mundane. Let's put it that way. Less of a life-changing thing.
Absolutely.
So, after your touring, New England Conservatory, I read, was where you studied violin, but you also studied conducting, I read. At what point did conducting sort of first enter into your thought processes as a teenager?
So when I was a freshman at New England Conservatory on the violin, we had a conductor named Ludovic Morlot, who I'm sure many of your listeners will be familiar with. And he was at that time the assistant conductor of the Boston Symphony. And so I think he took the job conducting the freshman orchestra at NEC, just for some experience, some extra money, I don't know. And he had a tough time because it was an orchestra full of a lot of people who didn't want to be in an orchestra, and he really had to work to get anything to sound out of that. And interestingly enough, he really worked in a way like a conductor. And I had worked with a wonderfully inspiring musician in Ben Zander, but Ben doesn't work like a normal quote unquote conductor. And Ludovic did. And I was very inspired by both sort of models. And I started talking to Ludovic a little bit. I just asked him a few questions, and he said, just go watch a lot of videos, because conducting is very difficult to teach, as I'm sure you know as well. And just see how it feels like. What does it look like to you? And so I checked out a video, DVD at the time, of Carlos Kleiber conducting the Brahms Second Symphony and Mozart 36 with the Vienna Philharmonic.
Iconic video.
Yep, I'm sure a video many of your listeners are familiar with. And as I was checking out the DVD, a guy was standing next to me, and I know him, and he said, "Have you seen that before?" I said, "No." He said, "Well, it's about to change your life." And I saw him a week later, and he said, "Well, what did you think?" And I said, "You were right." I just never had thought of conducting as being possible that way. And so I started becoming more interested in it. I got a group of friends together to do Beethoven 1, not knowing how difficult of a piece it was. So actually all those famous, the beginning of the first movement, the beginning of the last movement, those famous difficult conducting excerpts, I was so naive. I didn't know they were difficult. So they were easy at the time. And now they're hard. And then just sort of from there, I started being more and more interested in conducting, and basically bribing my friends with pizza and beer to get them to play, to read through symphonies with me.
Isn't it amazing the naivety of youth is a phrase that is often used. I do a summer course with the CBSO Youth Orchestra, and part of that course is that we offer the chance for students to conduct it if they want to for 20 or 30 minutes. And they can choose whatever repertoire they like. And I had an email come through, and somebody had asked to conduct Beethoven 5, and to which I emailed back to the management and said, well, let's see what that's going to be like. And it was the first time he'd ever conducted an orchestra, and he chose just the beginning of Beethoven 5, which is an astonishing choice. And as you just said, the opening of Beethoven 1 is it's so difficult technically to do, but like Beethoven 5. But with the naivety and sort of bravado of youth, you could sort of get through it, can't you? It's only later you realise, my God, what was I doing?
Exactly. I actually recently dug up the video of that performance. That was my first ever conducting performance, and I mean, there are things that I do naturally that I can't do anymore because if I overthink it, it just doesn't happen. And I watched that opening of the first movement, and I'm like, how did I do that at the time?
So who was teaching you at NEC? Was it Ludovic, or was there a specific conducting teacher there?
At the time, there wasn't a conducting program at NEC for undergraduate studies. So what I did was I took a course called Wind Ensemble Conducting with a teacher named Bill Drury. The thing is that Bill was very smart about the way he taught it, and he allowed people to do things that weren't just wind ensemble conducting. So I did a lot of different things, and I ended up finishing that semester with the Rite of Spring, which of course I couldn't conduct at all, but it was a fantastic experience to try it. And so I studied with him for a while, and then there was a point where there was kind of like a crossroads, like, what am I going to do? Should I try to study both? And that is what I ended up doing, was applying for the graduate program, which Hugh Wolf had just started at NEC. I was in the inaugural class of his conducting program. So I was very lucky that appeared just as I was finishing my undergrad.
Well, I played for Hugh Wolf many times. He came to Birmingham during my time as a player. Lovely man. Really enjoyed his conducting. What was he like as a teacher?
Fantastic. Just, I had a lot of instinct in conducting, and I had no know-how. I didn't know what I was doing, as we were saying. I didn't understand what was working and what wasn't. I didn't know how to study a score. I was very behind on transpositions, on really like the nuts and bolts, the basics of conducting. And Hugh, which I think is one of the best things about his teaching, is that he recognizes what each individual student needs, and he teaches that. So he saw that I needed help on the fundamentals, basically, and on the basics. And he walked me through all of that. He taught me how to study a score in terms of structure. And I still use most of his principles to this day on how to learn a score. And so, that was fantastic. And then also, more than the actual just studying with him one-on-one, was watching him rehearse with the orchestras at NEC. He is just a remarkably inspiring musician, because he is quite normal as a person, which is unusual for conductors. And he was able to sort of use that normalcy to also show a real passion in music and a total abandon in music. And I found that really exciting and different. And so I just loved watching him work. I loved playing in the orchestra for him. And studying with him was just like a crash course in everything you need to know as a conductor.
Yeah, it's perfect, isn't it? That's just what you need. And I mean, coupled with working with a wind ensemble, when you're a string player, you will have learned also things there that, I remember making a conscious decision when I started conducting properly, in inverted commas. My career started not to program violin concertos, because I wanted to do. I wanted to learn piano concertos, and I wanted to learn arias, and I wanted to. You have to get out there and push yourself. But yeah, that sounds great. I can imagine Hugh being like that, because he is such an open and honest person on the podium. He just comes across as being himself, which, as you say, some conductors don't. And that, to meet somebody that normal at such an early stage, I think was wonderful for you.
Yeah, he definitely emphasized that, that orchestras have a BS detector that is honed like no other group of people. And if you're not yourself, you're not going to do well, no matter how good of a conductor you might be. And I also found that his teaching was really great, in that he didn't sort of expect, he understood what school was for in a way. I remember at my audition, we had an interview, and he quizzed me on a few things. And I remember he showed me the four horn parts in the Egmont overture. And he said, "What are the notes?" And I didn't know. I hadn't studied transpositions at the time. And I just looked at him, very embarrassing. He'd been very embarrassed. And I said, "I don't know. Is this really bad?" He said, "No, this is what school is for, and you're going to learn." And within a month of being at school, I knew all the transpositions, because he taught them, and I studied them in theory class. So he understood what students need, and he didn't sort of throw you to the wolves if you didn't know things before you got there.
Well, that's good. That's wonderful. So would I be right in thinking that whilst you were still a student at New England Conservatory is when you applied to participate in the 2009 Malko competition?
Yes, that's correct. Yeah.
Which makes it even more amazing that you went on and won it. What was the whole process like? It was in Copenhagen, wasn't it? So it was over in Europe. How long did you have from applying and being accepted to learn the repertoire? And then how long was the actual competition? And then we'll talk about winning it afterwards, because that's another interesting topic.
Sure. So one of the things obviously every conductor needs is experience with an orchestra. And I wasn't really having that because the lab orchestra was tiny and, it's very hard for a, you know, 20-year-old conductor to get any gigs. And so I was trawling around looking for maybe an assistant job or a job with a youth orchestra. And I saw it was a job posting, basically, site called Musical Chairs. And the Malko Competition link was there. And I never heard of it before. And I saw, concerts with, I think, 16 Scandinavian orchestras, a very large financial prize. And I thought, why not? I'll just audition for it and or send a video and see what happens. And maybe I'll get accepted and then I can conduct and go out in the first round, but at least I can say I conducted an orchestra. And I got my friends together, recorded a video, Beethoven's Seventh Symphony, sent it in, and expected quite literally nothing. And then I got an email one day saying, we'd like to invite you to come. And I completely freaked out because I had literally never conducted any of the repertoire. And I think I will probably get this wrong, about 2 or 3 months to learn all of it. It wasn't like an insane amount of repertoire. It was a lot, but it wasn't a crazy list of pieces. There was a classical round, a romantic round, contemporary music, and concerto accompanying, and then a movement of a Brahms symphony and a piece of Nielsen because it was in Denmark. So it wasn't overwhelming. So I just basically started studying right away, and then again got my friends together to read through all of the repertoire, and then just hopped on the plane expecting. I didn't bring a suit for the final concert. I just didn't think it was at all possible that I could advance past the first round.
Well, you did an Andrew Litterman. In episode 2, he explains how he flew over to London to participate in the competition that he ended up winning. He said, I fully expected to go out knocked out in the first round and have a whole week sightseeing in London before I flew home again.
I had bought my plane. I had, after you were knocked out, they kick you out of the hotel basically, or they won't pay for it anymore. And I finished conducting, I walked off stage and I called the airline to change my flight to move it to the day after the first round, because I just was like, okay, that's the end of it. And luckily I didn't go through with it. I decided, I'll just wait and make sure I get knocked out before I make the phone call.
And so through to the final, and you end up winning. And as you said, engagements with Scandinavian orchestras, the financial benefit of winning a competition. So at this point, you now have a decision to make. I'm assuming maybe you didn't. It wasn't a difficult decision to make. Go back to school, go back to NEC, carry on studying with Hugh Wolf, or immediately get on guest conducting all over Scandinavia and Europe and wherever else that you got gigs with. What was the thought processes immediately after winning?
I think I was such a deer in the headlights. I just didn't get it. And it was also, by the way, of course, one of the biggest prizes was management.
Yes.
And that, instantly, it was not only those 16 orchestras, it was a manager looking for more and other managers coming calling. And I will be forever indebted to Hugh for this, because I went back to school and Hugh allowed me to do my concerts, miss 2 weeks of school at a time. The school also, NEC, I have to give them a lot of credit too. They let me miss 2 weeks of school, 3 weeks of school, of classes. And Hugh would change the repertoire that he was teaching to help me practice the pieces that I was about to do.
Wow,
and also we were able to organize it over the course of 3 years, where the bulk of the concerts were in the third year after winning. So I had a lot of time to get the repertoire ready, to practice it, to learn it. I only had, I think, 3 or 4 concerts in that first year. So it was really well organized. And also Hugh was willing to let me do both, basically have a professional career and study with him at the same time.
That's wonderful, and far thinking on both you and the NEC's part as well. I have one other quick question, and it comes on the back of an earlier episode with Jonathan Hayward, who won the Besançon competition, and part of the prize was a sort of mentorship from an artist manager, not necessarily affiliated to a company, but somebody who would be on the end of a phone when those agents, when the sharks start circling around the chum in the water, which you were, and talking him through decisions like moving concerts later on as you did, or which was the best manager to choose. With the Malko, did you have that, or were you basically thrown in at the deep end and the sharks come circling, and then you had to decide which manager might be the best for you?
I was extremely lucky in this case because of my family. My sister had worked with a manager for, at that point, 12 years. She had a very close relationship with Opus 3, who called right away after the competition, and she knew everybody there. My parents had all dealt with managers before, so they were able to really advise me. They came to my meetings with Opus 3 to discuss how things would work and taking things very slowly. There was no rush. And we decided to start with just an American agency and also the one from the competition, the Scandinavian agency that kind of came with it. And I was extraordinarily lucky to have that advice from the start on how to handle things. And, to wait to get a European manager for a year or two because I wasn't really ready for it. And I really definitely look back on that thinking if I hadn't had my family around who were embedded in the musical world, I would have been completely out to lunch. I was surprised at the final when a manager came up to talk to me, and I was calling my parents to keep them updated. I said, "Oh, yeah, a manager called me," and she's and my mom was like, "Yeah, we were waiting for that to happen." Like they knew what was going to happen. So it was definitely an experience that my family had experienced and that I was just going to go through the first time with their help.
The next thing that happened for you, I would say, is one of the wisest things because, well, again, going back to Jonathan Hayward, we talked about this, and hopefully you'll agree with me, that the next thing you did, notably, was to become the New York Philharmonic assistant conductor for 3 years. When, having won a competition like that, you could have basically filled your diary with guest engagements and not done something like being an assistant. I think it was a brilliant thing to do because being an assistant with an orchestra like that, you learn so much. And was it Alan Gilbert was chief conductor then?
Yes.
So yeah, you've got somebody like him that you can learn from. Do you look back and think, yeah, that was a really good decision?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
That was an amazing education in so many different ways. Learning psychology of working with orchestras from many different guest conductors, just having an office across the hall from the artistic administrator and hearing their discussions about like how programs should work and what guest artists to invite and things like that. It was a real education in so many different ways. So yeah, it's something, again, I was very lucky to be able to do it. And also, of course, getting to conduct the New York Philharmonic at 23 years old was, something I never could have expected 2 years before that. And the orchestra, it's funny, the New York Philharmonic has a reputation of being quite hard-nosed, and they are the nicest people. They're so easy to, and they'll be mad at me for saying this. They're so easy to work with. They are, in 3 years of covering conductors, I never saw them once be rude to anybody. They always wanted to do their very best. And so that was something really wonderful to see also, that even an orchestra that maybe on its face looks a little surly actually really wants to do a great job underneath. And when they were inspired, it was a kind of experience, a really unforgettable experience to hear them when they were really rocking.
Isn't it funny that you said that they'd be upset that you said that they were really, really nice when, public perceptions are that they could be hard-nosed. And one wonders whether, I can think of orchestras in this country which have a public perception of being, frightening to conduct for the first time. And you get in there and you discover actually it's far from that. In fact, it's almost the opposite. And I wonder whether it's based on stories and anecdotes from, let's face it, 30, 40, 50 years ago now.
I think so.
They're not current anecdotes.
Yeah. I think so. I mean, I've had one or two bad experiences with orchestras, but they weren't ones that you would expect. Actually, one was with an orchestra that was sort of famous for it. But the ones that I've gone to where people have said "look out," I've had nothing but pleasant times with those orchestras,
Yeah.
and my colleagues have had the same. And I don't think it's it's certainly not an easy job, and everybody wants things to be pleasant and easy to do, but it's not. I think maybe 30 or 40 years ago, the given was you were walking into a Shark Tank, and now I don't think that's the case.
Yeah. Well, and it is one of the pitfalls that come up so often on this podcast of guest conducting, first dates. That if you're a good conductor, which you obviously are, most of the time your experiences with an orchestra for the first time will be good. But it doesn't matter how good you are. Even the greats have fallen out with an orchestra on the first date and never gone back.
Absolutely.
And it happens, but you just have to sort of work a way through it.
Yeah, absolutely.
So whilst you were at New York, what were your roles? Obviously, you were covering everybody there, guest conductors and Alan Gilbert's weeks. But what did you actually get to conduct? Were you doing the sort of things that assistants do elsewhere, family concerts or young people's concerts? Did you have a subscription concert in each of those 3 years?
I did many of the family concerts, the young people's concerts, which, as someone who was an worship Leonard Bernstein, it was very exciting to do those for me. And in my final year, I did a subscription concert.
So that's good. I mean, it's what they're doing there is dripping you in bit by bit and not giving you a whole load of stuff right at the beginning, which is a really good way of doing it.
Absolutely.
During your 3 years in New York as assistant, you were doing your roles there, covering people. You were also guest conducting, and that would be when you first met the Lausanne Chamber Orchestra, I would imagine.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
What was that like? Was that love at first sight, or was it a drip, drip, drip of love over many visits?
So it was a one-shot deal. I learned that they were interested. I had a meeting with the executive director before he came to one of my concerts, actually in Copenhagen of all places. And then I went and conducted Schumann's Second Symphony, and I did Strauss' Second Horn Concerto with the horn solo player there. And it was just a really wonderful experience. Extremely warm group of people, wonderful sound, great energy, and it just felt really good most of the time. There was one moment actually in the rehearsals, which I still remember, where I thought I was torpedoing my chances because I was having a lot of trouble with one of those famous transitions in the second movement of the symphony, and I couldn't get it to work. And this was just, I think I did it 4 or 5 straight times, and I was, the anxiety was really coming up. And finally it worked. And I just, again, a little bit like with Malko, I kind of just said, all right, well, I didn't get the job, but now I can just enjoy this. And I think that helped a lot.
Yeah.
Because the next rehearsals and the concert were wonderful. And then they offered me the job.
Brilliant. And you've just had a contract extension through until the end of next season.
Yes.
What you've said you're starting a Beethoven cycle in September. So obviously things are opening back up there. And will you be suitably distanced? There's enough space, I'm assuming, to do a Beethoven cycle.
Yes. So it's a little bit unclear, obviously, because things change every day, what the regulations will be in Switzerland. They had a decently bad outbreak, but now they've really controlled it to the point where there's, I think, about 50 cases a day in the whole country. As an American, I am extremely envious of this. And
well, as a Brit, so am I.
Yeah. Well, I'm an American living in the UK, so I've got none of the most. But so we don't know yet. I've been in contact with the health and safety person in Lausanne, who's a violinist in the orchestra, and we've just been talking about testing and about distance, and we're just going to have to see really at the last moment what the situation looks like. But we do have enough space on the stage because it's a chamber orchestra to fit the whole orchestra on stage, even if we are 2 meters apart.
Great. Earlier, you talked about Hugh Wolf guiding you and teaching you a way of learning and assimilating scores. When you come to learn a new score, what is your system? And do you write things in your scores? It's about 50-50 at the moment between people who write things in as far as even like myself with red, blue, and black pencil, and then others who write nothing. So how do you go about learning a new score?
I it's interesting. I write a lot in the scores, but I don't really look at them during rehearsals. Like I don't look at what I've written during rehearsals, but I do write a ton, especially on like the first page of a score, and of each movement. Just ideas and images, things that help me sort of understand the piece. So I have a sort of like what I think is like a 15-step basic work thing to just make sure I know the score. So simple but fundamental things like structure is number one. What is sonata form? The basic large scale structure, phrase lengths, the character, tempo. Then I go through every melodic line, sort of just thinking about how I think it should be phrased, how I think it should sound, articulation, things like that. Then the next step is every accompanimental line. Then harmonic analysis, looking into the history of the piece. This is not in order. I'm just kind of off the top of my head. The historical background of why the person wrote it, what was going on in his or her life. Then harmonic relationships between keys in the movement or in the piece. Dynamic indications, expressive indications, the instrumentation, so I know what order to rehearse in. Then sort of like a vague term, like what kind of sound I can try to get from each section. Then measure numbers is number 14, I think. And then number 15 is actually just physically practicing the movement or the piece. So that's like sort of the top level. And then obviously the ideas of how, the images, the vision for it, that comes next. I was watching during this lockdown period a wonderful masterclass with Gergiev, where he told one of the conductors, you need to bring artistic luggage onto the stage. You have so many ideas that they're weighing you down. You have so many ideas to say to the orchestra. And if you use 10 of them out of the 1,000 you have, that's great. That's a success. And so I've been trying to incorporate that even more into my work.
Well, those masterclasses have been things like the Gergiev one, but I'm also thinking about the Ivan Fischer ones with Concertgebouw that were recently on. They've been amazing during lockdown, a sort of food for the brain and a nice, to have time to just sit and watch them.
Those have been so extraordinary. The Ivan Fischer ones, some of the best classes I've ever seen.
And some of the advice he's been given, I've been given to students for ages now in Birmingham or privately. There was a lovely moment we talked about. Find one word to describe it. Throw the packaging away. And find one word to tell me what's inside that packaging. You say, oh, thank God somebody's telling people this. It's wonderful.
Hugh Wolf used to say, "Solve this problem in 3 words or less."
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. All of the rubbish and guff and hot air that you hear some conductors come up with, and Fischer was just wonderful at that. I watched them live, and I've started rewatching them again late at night. Really good. Now we have one thing in common, which I'm sure we have many things in common. We're both violinists, both conduct, but we also both have a podcast. Obviously, you're appearing on mine. I'm not asking for an invite onto yours, but I'm interested to know, how long have you been doing it? What made you go into podcasting? Yours is very successful. 185 episodes. That takes a lot of time as well because of what you do in your podcast. So just give me some history on when you started it and how it sort of evolved from there.
I started it now, oh wow, it's been over 3 years, about 3.5 years ago. I have always adored Leonard Bernstein, especially his advocacy for music and his activism for music. And I thought, what would Leonard Bernstein be doing if he was alive, to sort of evangelize classical music? And at that time, there were almost no classical music podcasts, and there definitely weren't any by musicians. There were some done by symphony orchestras as a sort of like program notes, but there weren't any long form podcasts as far as I knew at the time. Now, like yours, there are quite a few. And so I just thought, why not make 5 or 10 episodes and see how it goes? And so I wrote up 10 episodes. I interviewed my parents. I interviewed a couple other people, did some shows on pieces I was conducting. And I fully expected to release it and get a few hundred people to listen, and that would be it. And just very slowly, though, I realized, first of all, that I loved doing it, and also that people were really excited about it. And I got some absolutely incredible emails about the show. And so I thought, okay, I should keep going. And now 3 years later, I think it's been downloaded over 1 million times. And it's something that is a real part of my life, and I do it every day. And by the way, I'm thrilled that I have it during this pandemic period for financial reasons, and also just for, having something to do every day, is to write, to record, to edit. It's a real job in the best way now.
Well, it's kept me sane, basically, starting this podcast. Between myself and also my manager Sarah, finding conductors who are willing to come on, working out the order of which they go, trying to find people with new. You're the first person who runs his own podcast, which is perfect because again, it's a new angle. I've been very much turned on to the whole thing, and each podcast has its own definite sort of target audience. And with yours, you do a lot on the repertoire, and I'm intrigued to know what makes you choose the pieces that you choose. For instance, the latest ones, I dipped in and out of Mahler 6, your first movement podcast the other day. Other than, is Mahler 6 coming up in your schedule soon? I wouldn't imagine it is, because of the size of the orchestra. But what makes you choose the repertoire? Is it just a love of the music, or do you have people say to you, "Can you do Mahler 6, please, Josh?"
Often I choose based on what I'm conducting. So it's the easiest way. It's also a great way for me to study and sort of, kill two birds with one stone. I can really do that. The other way is through Patreon, which is this crowd-funded. It's basically a way of pledging support to a creator's work. And so if you pledge at a certain level, you can choose a piece for me to analyze. And one person chose Mahler 6. So that was fantastic for me. I love doing that. So in the future, I've got episodes from people who have requested them on Patreon, from the Brahms Requiem, Goldberg Variations, Bruckner 4, Mahler 3. So I've got a lot to do with those. And then also I just choose for my own interests, especially now with, much less work happening. I can really choose and find new things. I'm trying to focus more on Black composers in the last couple of months, and also continuing now into the future. So I'll do a show on William Levi Dawson's Negro Folk Symphony, the music of William Grant Still, music of Samuel Coleridge Taylor. So it's really a chance for me to explore a lot of my interests, and often to do shows on things that I can't actually manage to conduct due, to various reasons.
Well, I highly recommend it to anybody. It's called Sticky Notes, available on all good podcast download sites, and probably some bad ones as well. And yeah, I recommend it highly. I've started dipping in, as I said, and I shall be listening and going back through the episodes and listening some more. Josh, it's 10 questions time, the moment that all the conductors love. And I start as ever with, what sound or noise do you love, and what sound or noise do you hate?
So my question is, do I have to answer in 3 words or less?
No. No, there's no Hugh Wolf or Ivan Fisher here. You can answer in as long as you like.
So a sound I love, this will sound very cheesy, but during the lockdown, when we were able to take walks but not do much more than that, my wife and I live near Richmond Park in London, and we took a walk into Richmond Park. And usually there are cars going through Richmond Park and planes flying overhead, and there was none of that at the time. This was in beginning of April, and we walked into the park. We found a quiet spot. There were no people around, and we sat down in front of a tree and just sat there for about an hour and a half. And there was literally no sound except a couple of deer that came by. And so the sound of just that nature, living in London, with everything that was going on was really spectacular. So it's a specific sound, but it was something I really loved. And on the alternate side, in terms of sounds I hate, so I record my podcast in my office, and living in Richmond, you live quite near Heathrow Airport, and so planes are constantly flying overhead. And in normal life, you don't care; it sort of becomes white noise. But when you're recording a podcast and have to stop talking every minute and a half because planes are on your flight route, the flight route for the planes is directly over your flat, that can get a little frustrating. So I actually often have to record my podcast around when the planes are coming in from the other direction, or else I just can't get it done. So that's a sound I hate.
Well, dear listeners, I'm sure you've heard the odd motorbike rev up on previous episodes, because I live on a dead straight road in Birmingham, and they're just reaching about between the gear change between second and third gear as they're going flying past my house. I haven't had one of the buses go past yet with the squeaky brakes, but yeah, it is annoying, and because I'm doing a live interview, I can't really cut them out. So, but in your show, exactly. I suppose you have to cut them out. If you had 24 hours free, what would you spend it doing?
24 hours. I think I would love to take a huge walk with my wife. Probably go see a movie. When it's safe to see a movie. Have a great meal somewhere. Just to be outside. And that's not just because of lockdown. That's a general feeling that I love being in nature, and being able to see. I love movies as well. So yeah, I mean, if I had a totally free 24 hours, some combination of nature, film, and food would be high on the list.
Who would be a favorite conductor of yesteryear?
Well, Carlos Kleiber and Leonard Bernstein for sure. Claudio Abbado. Harnoncourt in a totally different style. I adore him. Yeah, I think those four would be probably my top four: Kleiber, Bernstein, Abbado, and Harnoncourt.
And a favorite current conductor?
Kirill Petrenko in Berlin. Ricardo Chailly, Manfred Honeck, I love. Haitink, though he's technically not current because he's retired, but always Haitink. I'm sure I'm forgetting people.
Well, that's the problem. Who do you offend by leaving them out?
Yeah, exactly.
Sorry, I shouted over Sakari Oromo. Why don't you get
Sakari Oromo, yeah, Pavel Yervi. I think I'm Yannick Nézet-Séguin for sure. Esa-Pekka Salonen. Now I'm in the stage where I'm just trying to not offend people. So that if I forget anybody, I truly apologize.
What is the hardest work you have ever conducted?
In terms of technically, John Adams' saxophone concerto, which just ruined my life for a week because it's so difficult. And it's funny, I ran into him in Paris, and I was like, John, thank you for writing the hardest piece I've ever conducted. He said, oh, it's not that hard. I was like, yes, it is. It's really hard. In terms of physically and emotionally, I would say both. Shostakovich's 11th Symphony, which is so relentless and so devastating emotionally. That's way up there. Yeah, I think those two would. I mean, in terms of the technical and the physical and emotional side, that's where I would go.
Well, Shostakovich 11 was the last piece I conducted before lockdown happened. In London, in concert in St John Smith Square with the Kensington Symphony Orchestra, and at the time it didn't. Maybe I was being very blasé and naive. It didn't feel, but now looking back, it feels like a really emotional event. But yeah, you're right. It's such a dark piece.
It is, but it really depends on circumstances. Also, what pieces are emotional to us. I one of the most emotional performances of my life was unrelated to the music. It was November 9th, 2016. And it was a tour in Lausanne. We were in Zurich, and we were playing Schumann Rhenish Symphony, which is, such a happy piece. But it was the day after the 2016 election in the U.S., and I was just destroyed. And so getting through that concert was one of the hardest concerts I've ever had to do. And so, now Schumann 3 to me is just a piece that is joyous and is not difficult at all. But obviously, in circumstances, any piece can become the most difficult.
Yes, that's true. That's very true. When traveling abroad to conduct, what item could you not leave home without?
Well, this is a cop-out answer. Microphone, because of the podcast, but I'll try to think of something actually real. Even if I don't get to read it, I do really love to have a book with me. Just anything that will hold attention on a plane, and in the hotel. It's not always that I get to read it because of the pulls of phones and computers and things like that, but that's always the goal anyway.
Yeah. I often find that the one time I do get to read a book is if I'm guest conducting somewhere. I'm on my own. It's a new orchestra, and you end up eating on your own. Exactly. I read more then than I ever do anywhere else. What is the one thing you would change about being a conductor?
Well, I to be honest, I wish that there was a completely different relationship between conductors and orchestras. I always say, conducting is like the last dictatorship that is acceptable in society, in democratic societies. And the relationship, I think, can be so toxic, even when it's a good relationship. There is something wrong in a person making 100% of the decisions all the time, and this sort of hero worship of maestro and things like this. So, my favorite experiences with orchestras have been where that's not the case. With the Deutsche Kammerphilharmonie Bremen, which is one of my favorite orchestras in the world. The relationship is different, where the conductor does make the vast majority of the decisions, but there's a discussion, there's an openness, there's people throwing ideas back and forth. It really does feel like a chamber music ensemble. And so if I had a magic wand and could change something, it would be that adversarial relationship between a conductor and the musicians, because I think it gets in the way of making music together.
So true. We had a couple of people say pretty much the same thing, and those collaborative experiences are so enriching and so much more enjoyable than, I've been to a couple of places where they're basically just sitting there waiting to be told what to do, and
exactly.
And it just feels wrong. As you say, and you're right about the last job, in which being a dictator, one of the last places, you are basically a dictator. I think it's a brilliant answer.
Thank you.
Number 9. Again, this could be if you wanted to be a baseball player or whatever, anything you wanted to be or thought you might have been. What profession other than your own would you like to attempt?
Well, I did want to be a baseball player when I was a kid, but it's funny because one of the difficulties of conducting is knowing that a lot of people don't like you, and that's I've never liked that. But something that I'm extremely passionate about, other than music, is politics. And so some sort of political activism I would be very excited about. And also something that has grown in importance for me is issues surrounding animals. And so my wife and I would actually really love to start an animal sanctuary. We haven't gotten around to it, but it's something that we plan to do at some point.
If the world were to end tonight, what would be your choice of final meal and drink?
To be honest, I'm not a super picky eater. And my wife and I are vegan, which makes a lot of the more decadent things a little bit difficult to achieve. And so I'll be a total cop-out and say that I would just like the meal and drink to be with people I care about and love, and that's all that matters to me.
Not a cop-out. The last person I interviewed said exactly the same thing.
Okay.
So it's not a cop-out at all. Josh, it's been a real pleasure. Absolute pleasure. I hope when all of this is over, I can pop down to Richmond and have a pint and see you soon.
That would be great. I'd love to meet in person.
A Mic on the Podium was devised and produced by Michael Seal, with music by Ben Dawson. Next time, I chat with a Spanish conductor who, after playing flute professionally in the UK and Europe, has become a highly successful conductor. He has title positions in Spain, Sweden, Ireland and the US, and has recently been appointed as chief conductor in Melbourne, Australia, starting in 2022. But until then, bye-bye.